Hello, my name is Virginia Moffatt. I'm an author and activist from Oxford. I'm a Christian of the Catholic tradition, and I'm still a practicing Catholic. I'm delighted to be taking part in CRE 2020, and while I'm not sad not to be with you in person, I'm very pleased we've been able to do this remotely. The title of my talk is Understanding God's Love Letter to Us, and that phrase, God's Love Letter, comes from something the Pope said last year, that the Bible was God's love letter to us. And I'm going to be talking about my personal journey with the Jerusalem Bible that's recently been translated, the Revised New Jerusalem Bible. I'll also talk about my conversation that I had with the translator, Dom Henry Wansbrough OSB, a couple of years ago, and how Darton Longman and Todd have commissioned me to edit a series of study guides inspired by this new translation. I'm going to start with a short history of the Jerusalem Bible. In 1943, Pope Pius XII published an encyclical calling for translations of the Bible directly from the Greek and Hebrew text into people's ordinary languages rather than the Latin. French biblical scholars at the École Biblique in Jerusalem responded to this challenge, eventually producing the Jerusalem Bible in 1956, and it came with complete with detailed study notes. This French translation proved very successful, and so Darton Longman and Todd decided in 1966 that it was time for an English version. And this version was edited by Alexander Jones, and he was very keen to use the study notes to enhance British Catholics' understanding of the Bible. It included contributions from well-known Catholics such as J.R.R. Tolkien, and has been praised for its literary qualities. This is the version I grew up with, first during RE lessons at school, where it was the source Bible that we used for our discussions, and then as a teenager in the prayer group I attended. And I loved it both for its literary sensibilities, but also because it was critical for helping me explore and understand my faith at that time. 19 years later, in 1985, DLT decided to publish a new version of the New Jerusalem Bible, and this version was edited by Dom Henry Wansbrough OSB and a new team of translators working directly from the original Greek and Hebrew. They created a version that was available for use in churches, incorporated fresh scholarship, and updated the comprehensive study notes. This version of the Bible was published when I was 20, and although I was aware of it, it wasn't until we got married and received a copy as a wedding gift that I properly engaged with it. And this is our copy. It's been our family Bible for 23 years, so it's a little bit battered, as you can see, but it's had very good and helpful use. We've used it for deciding baptism readings, for moments of Bible study with friends, private reflection, and as I started writing for Darton Longman and Todd, I found it very useful as a source material for Bible. And so I was very pleased when I heard that Darton Longman and Todd were going to produce a new version of this Bible. And the idea of this version was it would be inclusive, so doing away with patriarchal language, that it would be easy to read and more accessible, and that the updated study notes and latest research would enable it to be a Bible for study and proclamation. And I was also really pleased when DLT approached me and said, would I like to meet Dom Henry Wansbrough, the translator? And so I travelled up to Ampleforth a couple of years ago to interview him about his work. And it was fascinating for me as a writer just to kind of hear how he works as a translator, but also as somebody who is an ordinary lay Christian to understand a bit more about the Bible that forms the basis of our faith. And you can see the full version of our conversation on DLT Bible's resources webpage. There were 5 short episodes, but what I thought I would do was just play a couple of clips from them to give you a flavour of our conversation. In this first clip, I asked Dom Henry about the impetus for having a new version of the Bible.
Okay, so in this section, one of the things we're very interested in to know is what was the impetus for this new translation? Why is my New Jerusalem Bible, why does that need updating?
Several things. Firstly, I was rather horrified finding how many mistakes, infelicities there are in the New Jerusalem Bible, and there was a lot which could be improved. Language changes, new ideas come in, and new ways of putting things. There were some elements of the Alec Jones translation which come through. He, for instance, was translating in the 60s, and he wanted it to read a bit like a novel. So you have, instead of saying Jesus said, I'm coming, said Jesus. Now that's quite difficult to read out.
Yes.
Especially if you haven't done too much preparation. And so I've ironed that out and returned to the Greek, which gives the Jesus said at the beginning of the sentence, and then what he actually said. That's easier to read. Then the inclusive language is a very important point. I think that's perhaps the single most important point.
You mentioned about the notes.
Yes, a lot has changed in the notes. A lot has changed in scholarship. I mentioned the fact that Adam and Eve are not historical persons, but the story is true, but in a different sense. It's teaching a lesson. And there are several things like that in the Bible. One other point, on the inclusive language, when the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, came out, the editor-in-chief wrote to me and said that they were very grateful, the committee were very grateful to me for the New Jerusalem Bible, and that's the inclusive language that there was in that. And they had used quite a lot of that. Well, on the other way around, I certainly have used the NRSV. Bible translators use the existing Bibles that there are and see what they are. You have a range of Bibles, and you say, yes, that's good. No, not quite that. And you choose between them and then adapt. So it's not plagiarism. It's not grabbing someone else's. It's combining and working through and improving with the use of other Bibles. And that happens quite a lot.
Would you say that's kind of about collective wisdom? Is that I love
Collective
the
is an excellent term.
Yes, I love the idea that we are one body and we all bring something to this, so that if we learn from each other. So I really like the fact that the New Revised Standard people learn from this, and then you learn from theirs to go into that.
Yes,
that's a really beautiful way of. We only know part of this picture, and we can only give our bits of the picture to it. So would you say that that's what's?
Yes, that certainly adds to it.
Yeah.
So inclusive language, clarity for reading, to make it easy to read and clear to read, and that has also been very important in the revision of the Psalms, which go into that, to make it easily intelligible to the 21st century reader.
And you can see from this clip that what's really interesting for me is how Bible translators work together. And it seems to me a really good metaphor for the people of God working together to understand better what God is saying to us in the Bible. In the second clip, we had a further conversation about language, and I think language really, really matters. So for me, it's fascinating to hear why one word would be translated in a particular way, and I think Dom Henry explains it very well here.
Many occasions when Jesus is called didaskale, and that in the Jerusalem Bible is translated master. No, it isn't master, it's teacher. And that's a specific thing about Jesus. He's a teacher, as well as being the Lord. Other little things like that. Dikaiosune, Greek word, dikaiosune, is sometimes translated justice, righteousness, uprightness. It has all kinds of overtones, and I think it's very important to get the right one. For that, there is no word which translates dikaiosune correctly, so I've used righteousness, which is not common English parlance at the moment, but you grow to understand what it means by its use.
And what would you say that its use was in this context?
It means, again, it sometimes means obeying the law. It can mean the justification that God gives. You're on the right lines.
Okay.
If you're dikaios, you're on the right lines.
That's really lovely, because righteousness is a word that often gets
Self-righteousness is a horrible connotation.
connotation. So that's a beautiful connotation for it.
Yes, yes.
I like that meaning.
So the first half of this talk has been about the Jerusalem Bible and its new version, and I do highly recommend this new translation. It's vibrant and lively, and it really does do what it says to be a Bible for study and proclamation. But I was really pleased when, after I met Dom Henry, David Maloney, his commissioning editor for DLT, approached me to edit a series of Bible study guides. And the idea of the Bible study guides, which are called How the Bible Can Help Us Understand, was to celebrate the launch of the Revised New Jerusalem Bible and help Catholics engage with it, and Christians of all types, and not just Catholics. And in each study, we focus on an aspect of life and consider how the Bible can help us understand that aspect of life better. And each Bible study is written from the perspective of each writer's lived experience. So they're very personal responses to biblical passages that throw light on the topic under discussion. So far, we've got 4 guides in the series, and we're hoping that we'll be able to do more. And the first 2 are Forgiveness by Frank Cottrell Boyce and Approaching the End of Life by me, which were published earlier this year in March. Our second 2 were supposed to be due in May, but unfortunately we have had a pandemic and that has affected publishing schedules. So Illness, Disability and Caring by Bernadette Meaden will be published in September, and its partner, Welcoming the Stranger by Denise Cottrell Boyce, will be out in the new year. I found it an enormous privilege to work with my fellow writers and listen and understand and hear about their thinking about the passages that they worked with, and their thinking about the subjects they were talking about. And I also found it really helpful for me to kind of dive into the Bible in a way I've never done before, to look at passages I've never really considered before and help me explore the topic I was discussing. And so I thought it'd be helpful to give you a sense of what the series is about, is to take a passage from each guide in turn and talk a little bit about what each writer has to say about it. So I'm going to start with Forgiveness by Frank Cottrell Boyce. And Frank, if you know his work, is a screenwriter and children's author. And so he has very strong storytelling sensibilities. And so his study guide takes a lot of familiar Bible stories and just kind of describes them in a very lively and energetic way. And he does that with the story of the woman caught in adultery, which we find in John 8, chapter 8, verses 2 to 11. At daybreak, he appeared in the temple again, and the whole people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand in the middle, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman has caught in the very act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses ordered us to stone women of this kind. What do you say?" This they said, testing him, so they might have an accusation to bring against him. But Jesus bent down and started writing on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Then bending down again, he continued writing on the ground. When he heard this, they went away one by one, beginning with the eldest, until the last one had gone, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing in the middle. Then Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She replied, "No one, sir." Then Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, do not sin again." So as Frank kind of lays it out, this story, here we have a story of some very harsh men in the temple, the scribes and Pharisees, kind of working on a very Mosaic interpretation of justice and retribution, so that a sin is punished. And what they're looking for is for Jesus to make a mistake, really, and either not uphold the Mosaic law or uphold it and be the person that condemns a woman to death. And as Frank says, instead of doing that, Jesus kind of ducks out of that completely, and instead ups attention by just writing in the sand and just making everybody pause and look at what's happening to this woman. And as he's writing in the sand, instead of condemning or defending the woman, he's forcing everybody to kind of look at themselves. And then he is able to make this statement, who is without sin? And at that point, everybody realizes that none of them have the right to condemn the women, and they sort of go away somewhat shamefaced. And what Frank is sort of saying that Jesus is doing in this is changing the nature of forgiveness, changing the nature of how we deal with sin. And instead of dwelling on the past, he's allowing the woman to start again, start afresh, move forward in life. And that is something that Jesus is offering all of us. So I found that a very helpful explanation of that story. And I really appreciated Frank's lively retelling of it, and the other stories that he looks at. When I was writing my own book, Approaching the End of Life, my starting point was thinking about why we're afraid of death. And early one morning when I was thinking about this, I just was kind of literally flicking through my Bible, my older Bible rather than the latest version. And I came across Ecclesiastes, the beginning of Ecclesiastes, which is allegedly written by Koheles, who was a preacher in the Temple of Solomon. But Koheles is probably just a fictional version, a fictional creation of a number of writers. But part 1 of Ecclesiastes begins with the words of Koheles. Vanity of vanity, says Koheles, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit is there for anyone in all that toiling under the sun? A generation goes, a generation comes, yet the earth stands firm forever. The sun rises, the sun sets, then to its place it speeds, and there it rises. Southward goes the wind, then turns round to the north, round and round it goes. Then back on its circles goes the wind. Into the sea go all the rivers, and yet the sea is never filled to the place where the rivers go. There they continue to go. All things are wearisome, more than anyone could express. The eye does not have enough of seeing, nor the ear is its fill of hearing. What was will be again, what has been will be done again, and there is nothing new under the sun. And when I read that, I just remember thinking, gosh, that could be somebody writing today, particularly when we live in the affluent West, where we have everything at our fingertips, but somehow we're all sort of searching for something, for some kind of meaning. And it kind of made me sort of think that the end of our lives becomes very meaningless, because what's the point of what we've done if nobody remembers, if everything just goes on the same, if human life is futile, that nothing changes and nothing we ever do amounts to very much. And so I felt that that passage particularly had a great meaning for me, and I think that it feels as well for the writer himself that he's just looking at the end of his life thinking, what's the point of everything I've done? However, later on in Ecclesiastes in chapter 3, he does come to some conclusions which I also then found very helpful and very comforting, which is that there is no happiness for a human being except in pleasure and enjoyment through life. And when we eat and drink and find happiness in all our achievements, this is a gift from God. And I know that whatever God does will be forever. And so I still find that incredibly helpful, because it sort of suggests to me that that actually what God is asking is that we just live our lives to the fullest possible ways we can and to the best of our abilities, and rejoice in our happiness, because it is short-lived and life is short-lived, but we have to make the most of it, and that God is somehow with us before and beyond us, and that gives us some comfort. And the fact that that was written thousands of years ago kind of suggests to me the kind of how God has been with us throughout human history and will continue to be. Our third book in the series is Illness, Disability and Caring, and Bernadette Meaden, who's written that book, is somebody who has personal experience of a chronic illness. So she speaks a lot from personal experience. She's also somebody who's written a lot about disability issues over the last 10 years and the impact that cuts in this country have particularly had on sick and disabled people. And I was very keen to get her to be part of this series because of that personal experience she has. What I like about her approach to this subject is that she starts off by saying that, there is nobody who's not valued by God. And we live in a society where sick and disabled people and people who care are often kind of ignored and made to feel worthless. And this idea that being valued by God is really, really critical. And the story that I'm going to kind of reflect on that Bernadette talks about is the cure of the blind man, which takes place in John chapter 9, verses 8 to 41. It's a very long story, so I won't read it all out, but I'll describe it. In the story, Jesus comes across a blind man begging, and his disciples sort of say, whose fault is it that he's disabled? Is it because he sinned or his parents sinned? And Jesus is very quick to say, no, that's not it at all. That he exists because God's work might be revealed in him. And then he goes and heals the man. And as often happens with the healing stories, the man is then called by the scribes and Pharisees, who want to find out what Jesus was doing, healing somebody on the Sabbath. And did it really happen? And first the man is questioned, then his parents are questioned, and the man is questioned again. And I'm always a bit uncomfortable about healing stories because I always feel perhaps they're saying that being disabled is wrong and life is better if you're not disabled. But I really loved Bernadette's insight because she felt that there were two important things about this story. The first is Jesus' rejection of the idea that disability is a sin, which is very, very different from the world he lived in at the time, because it was a prevalent thinking. And his very clear statement that God's work might be revealed in the blind man. And then it's the way that God's work is revealed in the blind man, because unlike most stories, disabled people often do not have any agency in their stories, and people and professionals speak above them. But here, the blind man speaks for himself. And in doing so, he not only does have a voice, but he has a very clear voice, and he challenges the people who are out to get Jesus. And he's very clear about what Jesus has done for him. And so the person that society has deemed inferior is in fact the wisest and most perceptive, and indeed God's works are revealed in him. So I found that a very useful understanding of that particular story. The final passage I'm going to look at is from Welcoming the Stranger by Denise Cottrell-Boyce, and again it's another familiar passage to us. It comes from Psalm 137, chapters 1 to 5. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept, remembering Zion. On the poplars that grew there we hung up our harps. For it was there that they asked us, our captors, for songs, our oppressors for joy. Sing to us, they said, one of Zion's songs. Oh, how could we sing the song of the Lord on foreign soil? If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. And that very, very poignant kind of lament for people who are exiled is something that I think we're all familiar with. That's a very common psalm we've heard spoken many times before. And Denise very helpfully, she's the one author in this so far who has had some theological training, and she helpfully puts the context around this story. This is a group of people who were part of the southern kingdom of Israel, of Judah, and they rebelled against the Babylonians, and in response their temple was razed to the ground and their holy places were destroyed. So they lost everything. And not only that, they were taken into exile and prisoners of the Babylonians for 70 years. So they had no homeland, they had no status, they had no wealth, and they were forced to live in a foreign land, lamenting the land that they had lost. And that experience, unfortunately, is all too common for refugees in the world today. And as Denise sort of points out, that it's a kind of, she points links with refugees that she's met in her time in Liverpool, who have had status in the place where they've come from and now are kind of living in poverty and sort of not welcomed and not valued by the world we're sort of living in. And unfortunately, that's a very common experience. As according to the UNHCR, 70.8 million people have been forced to flee their homes, 30 million of whom are unable to go back and need a safe refuge. And what I think Denise grapples with in Welcoming the Stranger is it's our Christian responsibility to welcome the stranger, and indeed many Christian groups do that very well. But there's a challenge to that when sometimes it's the poorest communities who are being asked to take on the burden, and they have fewer resources themselves, and that we need to sort of challenge ourselves as a society to find better ways of welcoming the stranger, as well as challenging kind of harsh immigration policies. So I hope that that's given you a bit of a sense of each of the guides that we have put together. And in conclusion, I just wanted to say sort of 5 points. I think all of us as writers of these study guides have recognised we've got our own personal journey with the Bible, and we've also found that by doing these study guides and by reading each other's work, we've enhanced our own journeys with the Bible. So we hope that they will help you as readers to have a better understanding of the Bible at the end of them. We've all found that by looking at familiar texts from a different angle, we've been able to find fresh insights, whether that's ourselves kind of looking at a story afresh or just seeing one of the other writers doing that. Bible stories and reflections that were written thousands of years ago still resonate today because they speak of ordinary human experience, and they also speak of God's role in that ordinary human experience, and give us a sense of confidence that God is still with us in good and bad. Some of the subjects we discussed in our books are quite kind of controversial. So Frank, for example, was exploring whether forgiveness is possible through the story of the young child who was killed by an American wife of a diplomat last year near an army base, and whether his family could ever forgive that woman. I was looking at the subject of euthanasia and the rights and wrongs about euthanasia. Bernadette looked at the rights and wrongs of fetal testing for disability, and Denise struggled with how do communities welcome a stranger when they have few resources. And we found sometimes that we could not find a simple answer to those questions, and sometimes we had more questions than we had answers at the end of our sort of grappling. But however, looking at the Bible with these difficult conversations, these difficult topics, we really helped us work out a little bit better where we stand, and helped us kind of think through the next sort of step on the way. Finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Pope has designated 2020 the year God speaks. And so it's our hope that both this wonderful new translation of the Revised New Jerusalem Bible and these study guides will help us individually and you as readers understand that that's God's love letter better in the future. So thank you very much for your time. It's been really wonderful to spend this time with you. And if you're interested in finding out more about Darton Longman Todd, our final slide gives the list of the books that I've talked about and a link to their website. Thank you very much.
Nothing beats sitting on it, hearing it, tasting it, wearing it, handling it, trying it, comparing it.
The copier produces 1,000 copies for £4. The Riso digital printer produces 1,000 copies for £1.20 at 140 pages per minute.
Discussing it.
The interesting thing about this centre is a very difficult breed on a very small site.
Buying it. Recommending it. I definitely recommend it.
It's always good to have resources, and yeah, this is very resourceful, so it's a great place to be.
Nothing beats being here. Buy your tickets online now. creonline.co.uk/tickets.